The year was 1887, and the dust of the high plains had settled into every line on Caleb Prescott's face. It was a fine, gritty sediment that spoke of drought, of loss, and of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical part of him. His ranch, a spread of parched land and sun-bleached wood that had once echoed with the laughter of a wife and the small, bright sounds of a son, was now a monument to silence. The wind that swept down from the mountains howled through the eaves of the cabin, not with the promise of rain, but like a thing grieving alongside him. Caleb had inherited the silence 3 years prior, delivered by the same fever that stole Martha and little Daniel from the world, leaving him the sole keeper of their memory. He worked from before the sun bled over the eastern rim of the world until long after it bruised into nightfall, driven by a need to exhaust his body so thoroughly that his mind had no energy left to wander down the shadowed paths of what used to be. He was a man hollowed out, going through the motions of living in a place where life had become a ghost. It was the failing pump that forced him into the settlement of redemption. The town was a misnomer, a clutch of raw timbered buildings that offered little more than whiskey, overpriced supplies, and the judging eyes of men who saw Caleb's grief not as a wound, but as a weakness. He avoided it whenever possible, preferring the honest cruelty of the land to the veiled contempt of its inhabitants. But the last of his cattle were lowing with a thirst he could no longer ignore, so he rode in on his aging mare, his jaw set and his gaze fixed on the door of the general store. As he was tying the reins, a commotion spilled from the saloon. Laughter, sharp and ugly, cut through the afternoon haze. At the center of the gathering was Garrett Vance, a man whose wealth was as new as his manners were old and foul. He stood beside a horse that took Caleb's breath away. It was a stallion, a magnificent paint with a coat like spilled cream and patches the color of wet earth. But its beauty was marred by a wildness born of terror. Its eyes rolled, white and frantic, and long, weeping scars tracked across its flanks and chest, a testament to a brutal hand. A rope was cinched cruelly tight around its neck, held by one of Garrett's hired men. "He's broken, I tell you," Garrett boasted, his voice thick with liquor. "Spirit's gone, but he won't let a man on his back. Too stubborn, too much wild blood." Standing a few feet away, her expression as still and unreadable as a stone carving, was a native woman. She was Cheyenne, that much was clear from the beadwork on her worn buckskin dress. Her black hair was braided, and her face, though etched with a quiet weariness, held a defiant beauty that seemed to rebuke the dusty ugliness of the town. She stood with a stillness that was not passive, but potent, as if she were the eye of the storm raging around her. Her gaze was fixed on the terrified horse, a flicker of something pain, kinship passing through her dark eyes. Garrett followed Caleb's gaze. "Ah, you see the rest of the bargain. She came with the beast, won them both in a card game from a trapper who'd lost his nerve. He said she's the only one who can handle him. Calls her a horse whisperer. I call her a silent savage." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. She did not flinch. The men laughed. Caleb felt a slow, cold anger begin to uncoil in his gut. It was an unfamiliar feeling, a flicker of life in the deadened landscape of his heart. He saw the horse, saw its panic and its pain, and he saw the woman, treated as little more than a piece of tack that came with the animal. Garrett, sensing a new focus for his sport, turned on Caleb. "What's the matter, Prescott? See something you like? A man like you, all alone out on that dust bowl you call a ranch. You could use a strong back, both of them." "The horse is mistreated," Caleb said, his voice rusty from disuse. "It's a broken thing," Garrett sneered. "Just like its keeper, just like some folks I know." The insult was clear, aimed squarely at Caleb's solitary life. "Tell you what, I'm tired of looking at it. I'll bet the animal. Your saddle against the horse." Caleb looked at his saddle. It was his last truly fine possession, a gift from his father, the leather worn to a soft gleam, the silver conchos a dull shine. It was worth more than he had to his name. The men around them murmured, sensing the shift in the air. "What's the wager?" Caleb asked, the words tasting strange in his mouth. Garrett grinned, a predator's smile. You see that fence post at the end of the street? If you can get that beast to walk to it and back, calm as you please, you win him. But you can't use a whip or a spur, just your hands and your voice. He glanced at the woman. And you can't use her. It was an impossible bet. The horse was a knot of pure fear. But Caleb had grown up with horses. His father had taught him that you don't break a horse's spirit, you earn its trust. He looked at the stallion's trembling flanks, the foam on its lips, and felt a pull, a sense of shared brokenness. I'll take the bet, Caleb said, the decision settling in him with a surprising solidity. He walked slowly toward the horse, ignoring the jeers and the bets being laid by the onlookers. He didn't look at Garrett or the other men. He looked only at the animal. He spoke in a low, steady murmur, the same tone he had used to soothe Daniel when he woke from a nightmare. He didn't try to touch the horse, not at first. He just stood near its head, speaking of water, of open pastures, of a gentle hand. He moved with a patience he thought he had lost forever, a quiet deliberateness that slowly began to penetrate the horse's wall of terror. The stallion's ears, which had been pinned back, flickered. Its frantic breathing began to slow. After what felt like an eternity, Caleb reached out a hand, not toward the horse's head, but to the cruelly tight rope. He worked the knot with slow, careful fingers, never breaking his soft monologue. The rope fell away. The horse shuddered, but did not bolt. Caleb then turned and began to walk, slowly, toward the distant fence post. He didn't look back. He just walked, his belief in the wager a fragile, flickering thing. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The horse, after a moment's hesitation, took a step. Then another. It followed him, its head low, its gait still uncertain, but it followed. It walked with him to the post, stood while he touched it, and then followed him back. A dead silence fell over the street. Caleb stopped before Garrett, his heart pounding not with victory, but with a strange, aching kind of hope. Garrett's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. He threw the lead rope onto the ground. "The horse is yours, Prescott," he snarled. "And so is she. A matched pair of broken things for your broken ranch." He gestured contemptuously at the Cheyenne woman. "Get her out of my sight." Caleb looked at the woman. For the first time, her eyes met his. They were not vacant or defeated. They were deep and dark and filled with a fierce, guarded intelligence. She was watching him, weighing him. He felt a flush of shame so profound it was dizzying. He hadn't won a horse. He had become complicit in the buying and selling of a human being. The journey back to the ranch was steeped in a silence more profound than any Caleb had ever known. The woman, whose name he did not know, walked with a fluid grace a few paces behind him as he led the nervous stallion. He had offered her his mare to ride, but she had refused with a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The refusal was not an act of submission, but of assertion. She would not ride his horse. She would walk on her own 2 feet. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the soft sound of her moccasins on the dry earth, a counterpoint to the heavy tread of his boots and the clop of the horse's hooves. He tried to think of something to say, but the words felt like stones in his throat. What could he say? "I'm sorry you were part of a drunken bet. Welcome to my desolate home where you are now, a prisoner of my supposed victory." Every thought was inadequate, insulting. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the desolate landscape in strokes of heartbreaking beauty. The silence of the place rushed out to meet them, the silence he had curated for 3 years. Now, it felt different. It was no longer just his own, it was shared, and her part of it felt heavier, more ancient and wronged than his own. He gestured toward the small, lean-to room that had been his workshop. It was sparse, but it had a cot and was protected from the elements. You can stay in there," he said, his voice rough. "It's dry." She looked at the lean-to, then at the barn where he was unsaddling his mare. Her gaze was level. She said nothing, but he understood. He was offering her shelter better than the barn, a distinction he hadn't been required to make. It was the smallest of gestures, a fragile seed of decency planted in the toxic soil of their meeting. She gave a single, brief nod and went inside, pulling the rough burlap curtain across the doorway. The first week was a study in observation and distance. Caleb rose at dawn and worked until dusk, his movements dictated by the endless, grinding needs of the ranch. He found that his solitude was gone, replaced by a constant, unnerving awareness of another person in his space. He would be mending a fence and feel her eyes on him from the doorway of the cabin. He would be drawing water from the well, and he would see her standing by the corral, watching the paint stallion. She never spoke. She ate the food he left for her on a plate outside her door, and the plate would be returned, cleaned, to the same spot. She moved with a quiet purpose that unnerved him. She was not waiting to be told what to do. She was watching, learning, assessing. The stallion was their first point of connection, though they never spoke of it. Caleb had put him in the largest corral, providing fresh water and hay, but keeping his distance. The horse remained wild with fear, pacing the fence line, his scarred hide twitching at every sound. On the third day, Caleb saw her slip into the corral. She didn't carry a rope or a bridle. She just stood in the center, her stillness a rebuke to the horse's panic. She began to hum, a low, guttural melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The horse stopped pacing. It turned its head, its ears twitching. For days she did this. She would spend hours in the corral, sometimes humming, sometimes just standing, a calm anchor in the horse's sea of fear. Slowly, miraculously, the stallion began to change. He would stand quietly while she was there. Then he began to approach her, sniffing her outstretched hand. By the end of the week, he was allowing her to touch his face, to run her hands over the terrible scars on his neck. Caleb watched from a distance, mesmerized. She was not breaking the horse. She was healing it. She was offering it a peace it had never known, and the animal was responding in kind. One afternoon, Caleb was splitting logs for the stove, his mind wandering. The axe was old, the handle worn smooth. His thoughts drifted to Martha, to the easy way she had filled their home with life. The grief came upon him suddenly, a physical blow that buckled his knees. He leaned against the chopping block, the axe slipping from his grasp, and the sharp blade sliced a deep gash across the back of his hand. He swore, wrapping the wound with his handkerchief, but the blood soaked through it almost immediately. He headed for the cabin to find a clean rag, his head down. As he passed her doorway, the burlap curtain was pulled aside. She stood there, her dark eyes on his bleeding hand. Before he could react, she stepped out, took his wrist with a surprising firmness, and examined the cut. Her touch was not rough, but it was decisive. She led him to the water pump and gestured for him to wash the wound. The cold water stung, but he did as he was implicitly told. Then she disappeared, not into her room, but toward the sparse, dry creek bed behind the cabin. She returned minutes later with a handful of broad, gray-green leaves. She crushed them between two stones, creating a pulpy mash which she applied carefully to the gash. It felt cool and soothing. Then she tore a strip from the hem of her own worn dresser sacrifice that struck him silent and bound his hand with a skill that spoke of long practice. He stood there, mute, as she finished tying the knot. The silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with the scent of crushed herbs and the weight of her unexpected care. "Thank you," he said. The words were wholly inadequate. She looked at his face, her gaze unwavering. "My name is Wavina," she said. Her voice was low and clear, like water running over smooth stones. It was the first time she had offered him a piece of herself. "Caleb," he replied, feeling foolish for not having introduced himself sooner. She nodded, as if accepting this small exchange as a treaty. Then she turned and walked back toward the corral, where the stallion watched her, waiting. Caleb looked at his bandaged hand. The bleeding had stopped. For the first time in 3 years, someone had tended to one of his wounds. The sharing of her name, Wavina, and the tending of his hand marked a subtle but profound shift in the climate of the ranch. The hard frost of mistrust began to thaw, slowly, around the edges. Caleb stopped leaving her food on the porch like an offering to a wild spirit and instead began to set a second place at the rough-hewn table inside the cabin. The first time he did it, she hesitated at the threshold, her eyes questioning. "It's warmer in here," he mumbled, feeling the heat rise in his own neck. She entered and sat, her posture erect, her silence still a shield, but she was there. Their first meals together were exercises in quietude, the only sounds the scrape of forks on plates and the sighing of the wind outside. But gradually, the silence became less a void and more a shared space. It was a language of its own, built on mutual observation. She noticed the way he always paused before eating, a ghost of a prayer for a family no longer there. He noticed the way she saved a small piece of her bread, taking it out to the corral for the stallion later. He learned the stallion's name one evening as he watched her with the horse. The animal's coat was beginning to regain its luster, and the fear in its eyes had been replaced by a deep, abiding trust in her. It nudged her shoulder gently as she groomed it with a brush Caleb had left on the fence. "He's a good horse," Caleb said, approaching the corral slowly. Wavina didn't turn. "His name is Wavoka," she said. "Wavoka," Caleb repeated. "What does it mean?" She turned to look at him then, the setting sun catching the high planes of her cheekbones. "It means, he who makes sea." The words settled in the air between them, heavy with a meaning Caleb was only just beginning to understand. Wavoka. The horse wasn't just being healed, he was a conduit for sight, forcing Caleb to see beyond the grime of redemption, beyond the brutishness of Garrett Vance, and to see the woman who stood before him. He was beginning to see Wavina. Their conversations started as small, practical things. She would point to the sky and say a single word in Cheyenne, a word for a certain type of cloud that promised rain. He, in turn, would explain the workings of the stubborn pump, how to coax it into life. She showed him which roots were edible, which berries were sweet, and which plants could be made into a tea that eased the ache in his weary bones. He showed her how to mend a leather harness, the rhythmic work of the awl and thread a meditation he had learned from his father. Slowly, pieces of their pasts began to surface, offered up like rare, fragile gifts. He found himself talking about Martha, not the pain of her loss, but the joy of her presence. He spoke of her laugh, of the garden she had managed to coax from the unforgiving soil. Wavina listened, her dark eyes filled with a deep, quiet empathy that asked for nothing and offered everything. One night, as a coyote called from the distant hills, she spoke of her own people. She did not speak of a massacre or a great battle, but of something slower and just as deadly. She spoke of a bad winter, of sickness, of a treaty that was a lie. She spoke of her family being scattered like seeds on a hard wind, of being taken by a trapper who saw her only as a commodity. Her story was told without self-pity, a recitation of facts that were all the more devastating for their starkness. Caleb listened, and the last of his resentment for his own lonely fate withered away, replaced by a profound and humbling shame for the world that had done this to her. His grief was a private tragedy. Hers was the wound of an entire people. He had lost his home within these walls. She had lost a whole world. The peace they were building was a fragile thing, a house of cards in a world full of harsh winds. Caleb knew it. He saw the way men from the settlement would sometimes ride out to the edge of his property, their curiosity a malevolent thing. He knew that a man like Garrett Vance did not easily forget a public humiliation. The wind came one hot, dry afternoon, not in the form of a storm, but as 3 riders cresting the hill. It was Garrett and 2 of his cronies. They rode not with purpose, but with a swaggering menace, stopping their horses just beyond the fence line. "Prescott," Garrett yelled, his voice carrying on the still air. Wavina, who had been watering Wavoka, froze. The horse sensed her tension and sidled closer to her, stamping a hoof. Caleb walked out of the cabin, his hands empty but his posture rigid. "Vance, this is private property." "I've been thinking about our bet," Garrett sneered, his eyes flicking from Caleb to Wavina and back again. "Seems to me you had an unfair advantage. You had the horse witch here to help you." His gaze on Wavina was greasy, possessive. "I think I want my property back, not the horse, the other piece." The cold anger Caleb had felt in town returned, but this time it was not a flicker. It was a hot, cleansing fire. "She is not your property. She was never your property," he said, his voice dangerously low. "The bet was for the horse. You lost. Now leave." One of Garrett's men laughed. "Listen to him. Playing protector. What's she do for you, Prescott? Keep your bed warm at night." Before Caleb could move, Wavina stepped forward. She stood beside him, her face a mask of cold fury. She did not look at Garrett, but at the man who had spoken. She said something in Cheyenne, her voice sharp and cutting as flint. The man's laugh died in his throat. He shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Garrett's face darkened. "You'll regret this, Prescott, both of you." He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. "A man has to protect what's his. I'll be back for what's mine." They galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a silence thick with threat. Caleb looked at Wavina. She was trembling, not with fear, but with rage. He saw in that moment the warrior spirit that had been buried beneath layers of forced stoicism. "What did you say to him?" Caleb asked quietly. Her gaze met his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of a grim smile on her lips. "I told him that his spirit was coyote, small, and that he would die cold and alone, and the buzzards would not even find his bones worthy to pick clean." Caleb felt a laugh bubble up, the first real laugh he'd had in years. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound, but it was real. He had won a horse in a bet, a magnificent animal named He Who Makes Sea. But standing beside him, her spirit burning as brightly and fiercely as a prairie fire, was the woman who had taught him how to see again. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would let his own bones bleach in the sun before he let anyone harm her. The ranch was no longer just his place of grief. It was their home, and he would defend it. The threat left by Garrett Vance hung in the air like the oppressive heat before a thunderstorm. Caleb and Wavina moved through the following days with a heightened awareness, a silent accord passing between them. They were no longer just two wounded souls coexisting, they were partners in a fragile alliance, bound by a shared enemy. Caleb began carrying his father's old rifle with him as he did his chores, its weight a grim but necessary comfort. Wavina's eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, her ears tuned to any sound that was out of place. The storm broke not with thunder but with fire. It came in the dead of night, a week after Garrett's visit. A new moon hid the world in a deep, inky blackness. Caleb was woken by Wovoka's frantic whinnying, a sound of pure terror that sliced through his sleep. He sprang from his bed, grabbing the rifle, and burst out of the cabin door. The smell of smoke and burning hay hit him first. A hellish orange glow flickered against the side of the barn. Flames were already licking up the dry timber walls, greedily consuming the place where he stored his meager winter supplies and where the old milking cow and her calf were sheltered. He saw three figures on horseback, silhouetted against the growing blaze. It was Garrett and his men. They weren't there for a confrontation, they were there for destruction, to burn him out, to destroy what little he had. "Wavina," he yelled, his voice raw with urgency. She was already there. She had emerged from her room, not in panic, but with a terrifying calm. In her hands, she held the heavy iron skillet from the hearth. Her eyes were fixed on the burning barn, on the panicked sounds of the animals trapped inside. "The cattle," she said, her voice tight. Their minds worked as one. There was no time for discussion, only action. "I'll keep them back. Get the animals out," Caleb shouted, levering a round into the rifle's chamber. He fired a shot into the air, high above the riders' heads. The crack of the rifle echoed across the plains, a stark declaration. "Get off my land!" The riders, startled by the resistance, pulled back, their laughter turning to curses. Garrett yelled an order, and one of his men raised a pistol, firing wildly toward the cabin. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Caleb's head. While their attention was on Caleb, Wavina ran, not away from the fire, but toward it. She moved like a shadow, using the flickering light and deep darkness to her advantage. She reached the large side door of the barn, the one leading to the stalls, and with a strength he never would have imagined, she heaved the heavy barred door open. Smoke and terrified lowing poured out. The cow and its calf stumbled into the night, their eyes wide with fear. But Wavina wasn't done. She darted back toward the inferno. Caleb's heart seized. He thought she was going back inside. Instead, she ran to the main corral, where Wavina was rearing and plunging against the fence, trapped. While Caleb laid down, suppressing fire, forcing Garrett's men to take cover, Wavina slipped the latch on the corral gate. Wavina, free, galloped into the darkness of the open prairie, away from the fire and the gunfire. Garrett, enraged that their plan was falling apart, spurred his horse forward, charging directly at Caleb. "This ends now, Prescott," he roared, his face demonic in the firelight. Caleb stood his ground, raised the rifle, and took aim. But he didn't aim for Garrett. He aimed for the horse. It was a shot his father had taught him, a last resort. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the earth just in front of the charging horse's hooves. The animal screamed in terror, rearing violently and throwing Garrett from the saddle. He landed hard with a cry of pain. His two men, seeing their leader unhorsed and the fight turning against them, lost their nerve. They exchanged a panicked glance, wheeled their horses, and fled into the night, abandoning their employer. Garrett struggled to his feet, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle. He stared at Caleb, his face a mask of hatred and disbelief. But his gaze shifted to Wavina, who now stood beside Caleb, the iron skillet held like a warrior's shield. He saw them standing together, united against him, framed by the defiant light of his own failed destruction. He saw not two broken things, but an unbreakable whole. Without another word, he scrambled to his fallen horse, hauled himself into the saddle with his good arm, and galloped away, a broken man disappearing into the darkness he had tried to wield as a weapon. The fire raged on, but the human threat was gone. Caleb and Wavina worked together, using buckets of precious water from the well not to save the barnet was already lost, but to keep the flames from spreading to the cabin, to their home. They worked until their muscles screamed and their faces were black with soot, a silent, efficient team moving through the ruin. By the time the sun began to rise, the barn was a smoking skeleton of charred timbers. The fire was out. Exhausted, they stood together and surveyed the damage. The heart of the ranch's operations was gone. It was a devastating blow. Caleb's shoulders slumped. For a moment, the old despair threatened to reclaim him. All this work, all this fighting, for what? To be left with even less than before. He felt a touch on his arm. Wavina was looking at him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes clear and steady in the pale morning light. She gestured with her head toward the open plains. In the distance, standing on a ridge and silhouetted against the dawn, was Wavina, and not far from him, grazing peacefully, were the cow and her calf. They hadn't lost everything. They had saved the living things. They had saved each other. He turned to her, the smell of smoke and wet ash filling his senses. "I'm sorry," he said, the words encompassing everything. "For the bet, for how you came to be here, for all of this." She held his gaze, and her expression softened. A deep understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of the long, hard road they had traveled from that dusty street in redemption. She reached out and, with her thumb, gently wiped a smear of soot from his cheek. "We are here," she said simply. It was not an accusation or a statement of fact. It was a declaration. We, In that single word, a new foundation was laid upon the ashes of the old. The fire had taken the barn, but it had forged something far stronger in its place. In the weeks that followed, the ranch began its slow rebirth. The rhythm of their lives found a new, more deeply intertwined cadence. They cleared the charred remains of the barn together, the shared labor a balm for the trauma of the fire. From the usable timbers, Caleb, with Wavina's steady help, began to construct a smaller, more practical shelter for the animals. The silence that had once defined the ranch was now filled with new sounds. The lowing of the cow, the soft nicker of Wavoka as he trotted in from the prairie each evening, and, most remarkably, the sound of their voices. They talked as they worked, their conversations weaving a tapestry of shared existence. He told her stories of his boyhood in the east, of green hills and plentiful rain. She taught him the Cheyenne names for the stars that blazed in the vast, clear night sky, telling him the legends that went with them. The hollow space in Caleb's heart, the one carved out by grief, began to fill with something new. It wasn't that the memory of Martha and Daniel faded. Rather, the sharp edges of their absence were being softened by Wavina's presence. He found himself smiling without thinking, a real smile that reached his eyes. He watched her one afternoon, her head bent as she stitched a patch onto his worn shirt, her movements deft and graceful, and he felt a wave of affection so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. It was a quiet, gentle love, born not of sudden passion, but cultivated slowly in the hard soil of mutual respect and shared survival. She, in turn, began to let her own guard down completely. The stoic mask she had worn for protection was shed, revealing a woman of deep warmth and quiet humor. She would sometimes laugh, a low, musical sound that Caleb came to cherish more than the promise of rain. She had found a sanctuary, a place where she was not property, not a savage, but a person. A partner, a woman named Wavina. One evening, as the sky was brushed with the violet and rose of sunset, they sat on the porch of the small cabin. It wasn't the home he had planned, but it felt more real, more solid than it ever had before. Wavoka stood at the corral fence, his coat gleaming, his scars now just a faint, silvery map of a past he had survived. He was no longer a broken thing, neither were they. Caleb looked at Wavina. She was gazing out at the land, her land now as much as his, her expression one of profound peace. The life he thought had ended 3 years ago hadn't ended at all. It had been waiting for him to be brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to make a reckless bet, waiting for the arrival of a woman and a horse who would teach him how to see again. He reached over and tentatively took her hand. Her fingers were strong and calloused from work, but they curled around his, fitting perfectly. She turned her head and smiled at him, a true, open smile that held the promise of 1,000 sunsets to come. The world still held its harshness, and the land its challenges, but Caleb Prescott was no longer alone in facing them. He had been a struggling cowboy who won a broken horse in a bet. He had been a fool. He had thought the stallion was the prize, but he knew now, with every fiber of his being, that the true prize was the magnificent, resilient, beautiful woman who sat beside him, her hand in his. As they watched the day come to a quiet and perfect close, they were home.